The mall was already heaving with energy when the doors unlocked at 5 a.m. The air was charged with anticipation, a frantic, almost manic kind of excitement. Black Friday was less a shopping event and more a chaotic tradition, a survival of the fittest among consumers. Shelley, a seasonal worker at Evermart, braced herself for what she knew would be a grueling day. She had heard stories about Black Friday, people trampling others for televisions, customers breaking into fights over discount toasters. But it was her first time experiencing it firsthand. The crowd stormed in as soon as the glass doors slid open. Shelley's register was located in the electronics department, arguably the most dangerous place in the store on Black Friday. Her manager had jokingly referred to it as the war zone. As the morning stretched on, she found herself bombarded by impatient customers barking at her to scan faster, her fingers fumbling with barcode stickers as the line never seemed to diminish. Then he appeared. Shelley noticed the man because he wasn't like the others. While customers shouted, pushed, and grabbed at shelves, he stood perfectly still near the corner of the department, his eyes fixed on her. He was tall, gaunt, with a face that seemed both lifeless and unsettlingly intent. He wore a black coat, zipped up to his neck, and his hands gloved despite the warmth inside, and rested calmly at his sides. "Do you need help finding something?" Shelley called out, forcing politeness into her tone. The man didn't respond. He only tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. Shaking off the unease, Shelley returned to the frenzy at her register. But she could still feel his gaze, a prickling awareness that made the hairs on her arms rise. Every so often, she glanced toward the corner. The man hadn't moved. By mid-afternoon, the chaos had only escalated. People were growing more irritable, the lines swelling into a restless mob. Shelley's register began to malfunction, the scanner refusing to pick up barcodes. Customers groaned, some swearing under their breath, while others outright yelled at her. "I'm sorry," Shelley stammered, sweat beading on her brow. "Let me try again." Behind her, the manager's voice barked over the intercom, summoning her to the stockroom. Grateful for the temporary reprieve, Shelley handed the register over to a coworker and ducked into the back. The stockroom was dim, the overhead lights buzzing faintly. She scanned the area for her manager, but found no one. She called out, her voice echoing. Silence greeted her. Just as she turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind her. "Hello?" she called, her voice faltering. A shadow moved at the far end of the room. Her breath hitched. "Who's there?" No answer. She started toward the door, but her feet felt heavy, as if the air itself had thickened. A figure stepped into view, the man from earlier, his face pale as wax under the flickering fluorescent light. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. His lips twitched, forming a grotesque smile that didn't reach his eyes. Slowly, he raised a hand and pointed at her. "What do you want?" Shelley's voice cracked. He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer. She backed away until her spine pressed against the cold steel shelves. Panic surged as the man reached into his coat. Her mind raced. Scream? Run? Fight? He pulled out a black envelope. Shelley blinked, confusion momentarily overriding her fear. He held it out to her, his eyes unblinking. She hesitated before snatching it from his hand. The envelope felt oddly warm. Inside was a single slip of paper with 2 words scrawled in crimson ink. "Look up." Her heart pounding, Shelley lifted her gaze to the ceiling, and she screamed. Dangling above her, barely visible in the dim light, were mannequins. But these weren't store mannequins. Their faces were twisted in expressions of agony, their limbs contorted unnaturally. One had its head bent at an impossible angle, another's mouth was sewn shut. Shelley stumbled backward, dropping the envelope. When she looked back, the man was gone. She bolted out of the stockroom, nearly colliding with her manager. "What's wrong with you?" he demanded. "Did you see him?" she gasped. "The man in the black coat?" Her manager frowned. "What are you talking about? There's no one back there." Shelley tried to explain, but her words sounded absurd, even to herself. The mannequins, the envelope, the man. How could any of it be real? The rest of her shift passed in a haze. She couldn't shake the image of those lifeless figures or the man's eerie smile. As the clock struck midnight and the store closed, Shelley hurried to her car. The parking lot was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows. She slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors. As she started the engine, her rearview mirror caught movement in the back seat. Her blood froze. The man was there, his face inches from hers, his cold breath fogging the glass. Shelley screamed, but it was too late. The night of Black Friday began like every other year for Jenna. As a manager at Blue Point Superstore, she was no stranger to the madness that came with slashed prices and desperate shoppers. By 8 p.m. Thanksgiving night, a line of eager customers had already formed outside the store, stretching into the freezing night. The doors wouldn't open until midnight, but people were camping out, huddled in blankets and eyeing each other like predators waiting for the hunt to begin. Inside, Jenna walked through the aisles one last time, making sure everything was in order. Displays of discounted televisions, gaming consoles, and kitchen appliances were stacked high. The employees wore nervous smiles, bracing themselves for the storm. But something about this year felt off. Jenna couldn't shake the creeping sensation that the store itself seemed different. The fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, and the usually cheerful holiday music sounded warped, as though it were playing underwater. At midnight, the doors opened, and the wave hit. Shoppers poured in, some nearly trampling each other in their rush. Jenna stationed herself near the entrance, trying to maintain some semblance of order. The crowd was a cacophony of shouting voices, clattering carts, and the occasional yelp of someone losing their footing. Then came the first scream. Jenna's head snapped toward the electronics section. She shoved through the crowd, her manager badge doing little to part the sea of frantic customers. When she reached the source, a woman was kneeling on the floor, clutching her arm. Blood seeped through her fingers, staining her sweater. "What happened?" Jenna asked, her voice sharp over the chaos. He bit me," the woman stammered, her eyes wide with terror. "Who?" Jenna looked around, but the crowd seemed oblivious, too consumed by grabbing their deals. "He was wearing a hoodie, but his face, it wasn't right." The woman's words dissolved into sobs. Jenna called for security, but the store's 2 guards were already overwhelmed trying to break up fights in the toy section. The woman was escorted to the back office, and Jenna resumed her rounds, her nerves prickling. Minutes later, another scream echoed through the store. This one was louder, more guttural. Jenna followed the sound, dreading what she would find. Near the frozen foods aisle, a man was on his knees, his body convulsing. Shoppers were backing away, some muttering in confusion, others snapping pictures on their phones. "Sir, are you okay?" Jenna approached cautiously. The man's head snapped up, and Jenna recoiled. His eyes were pure black, his pupils swallowed by darkness. His mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, teeth glinting like jagged shards. Without warning, he lunged at her. Jenna barely dodged, slipping on the slick tile as the man growled, a deep, inhuman sound that didn't belong in a human throat. "Call 911, she shouted at the onlookers, who were now screaming and scattering. Jenna scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. She retreated down the aisle, watching in horror as the man turned on a nearby shopper. He grabbed the woman by the shoulders and sank his teeth into her neck. Blood sprayed, and Jenna gagged at the metallic scent that filled the air. The lights above flickered again, then went out entirely. The store plunged into darkness, broken only by the occasional flash of someone's phone. Jenna's ears filled with the sounds of panic. Shouts, crashes, and somewhere in the distance, a guttural laugh. Her radio crackled to life. "Jenna! Jenna! Come in!" It was one of the employees, her voice trembling. "I'm here," Jenna whispered, ducking behind a display of canned goods. "What's going on?" "I don't know. People are attacking each other. Biting, clawing. It's like they've gone insane." A loud crash interrupted the transmission, followed by a blood-curdling scream. The radio went silent. Jenna tried to calm her breathing, clutching her radio like a lifeline. She needed to find the remaining employees and get them out. Crawling through the aisles, she reached the front of the store. The automatic doors had stopped working, trapping everyone inside. In the faint glow of her phone's flashlight, Jenna saw something that made her stomach drop. A group of shoppers stood in the middle of the store, unmoving. Their heads were tilted upward, their mouths open as if screaming, but no sound came out. Black liquid dripped from their eyes and mouths, pooling at their feet. "What the hell is happening?" Jenna whispered, tears welling in her eyes. One of them turned, sensing her presence. Its head swiveled unnaturally, too fast for a human. Jenna froze, her flashlight illuminating its face. The features were barely recognizable, skin stretched too tight, eyes black as voids. It smiled, revealing teeth sharpened to points. "Join us," it whispered, though its mouth didn't move. Jenna bolted, her sneakers squeaking on the blood-slick floor. She ran past toppled shelves and abandoned carts, desperate to find a way out. Behind her, she heard the sound of footsteps, hundreds of them, chasing her. She reached the stockroom and slammed the door shut, barricading it with a nearby pallet jack. Her chest heaved as she pressed her ear to the door, listening to the cacophony of footsteps and guttural growls outside. The radio crackled again. "Jenna?" She grabbed it. "Who is this? Are you okay?" The voice on the other end wasn't human. It was distorted, deep, and layered, as though several voices were speaking at once. "We're inside," it said. The lights in the stockroom flickered, then went out. Black Friday always brought a unique chaos to Ridgeway Mall, but this year felt different. For Emily, a seasonal employee working in the sprawling department store, the night seemed darker, the energy more unhinged. The line of shoppers wrapped around the building long before midnight, their faces shadowed under dim parking lot lights. By 12:01 a.m., the floodgates opened. Emily stood at her register near the store's entrance as customers surged inside, shouting, shoving, and clawing at deals like animals. Televisions flew off pallets, carts crashed into one another, and the air buzzed with tension that teetered on violence. Emily had barely started ringing up purchases when she noticed the man. Unlike the others, he didn't push or yell. He stood at the far edge of the store, near the outdoor gear section, watching. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his clothes hung loosely as though they didn't belong to him. His head was slightly tilted, his unblinking gaze fixed on her. She tried to ignore him, busying herself with the endless line of customers. But every time she glanced up, he was there, unmoving. An hour passed, then another, and the chaos only escalated. Emily's shift blurred into a mess of impatient voices and the constant beep of the scanner. She'd almost forgotten about the man until she caught movement in the corner of her eye. He wasn't at the outdoor gear section anymore. He was closer. He stood near a display of discounted blenders, his body angled slightly toward her. His face hadn't changed, still pale, still blank. Emily's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to focus on her work. Another hour slipped by. When she dared to look again, her heart stopped. The man now stood in the line at her register, empty-handed, his eyes locked on hers. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to sound polite despite the lump in her throat. He didn't answer. He simply stared, his lips twitching into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Sir, do you need something?" She tried again. Still nothing. "Hey, buddy, move it along," a customer behind him barked. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head further, his neck cracking audibly as it moved. Emily felt a cold sweat drip down her spine. Her manager, Carl, appeared behind her. "Everything okay here?" he asked, glancing between Emily and the man. Before she could respond, the man stepped out of line and walked away, vanishing into the sea of customers. Emily exhaled, her hands trembling. Carl frowned. "You all right?" "Yeah," she lied. "I'm fine." The rest of her shift crawled by, but the man didn't return. By the time the crowd thinned and the store approached its 3 a.m. lull, Emily started to believe she'd overreacted. Maybe he was just a strange shopper. Carl asked her to help restock the toy section, which had been ravaged by frantic parents. Emily agreed, eager to move away from the registers. She grabbed a cart of boxed toys and headed to the back corner of the store. The aisles were eerily quiet now, the energy of the night replaced by an uneasy stillness. As Emily worked, she heard faint rustling. She paused, glancing around the empty aisle. "Hello?" she called out. Silence. She shook her head, chalking it up to her imagination. But then the sound came again. Closer this time, like the shuffle of feet on tile. "Carl?" she called out, her voice louder now. No response. Her heart thudded as she slowly pushed her cart forward, peeking around the edge of the aisle. At first, she saw nothing, just scattered toys and overturned displays. But then she noticed the shadow. It stretched unnaturally long, slanting across the floor despite the overhead lights. The shadow moved, though no one was attached to it. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The shadow twisted, its form warping until it resembled a figure. Tall, thin, with arms that stretched too far and fingers that ended in sharp points. The lights above her flickered violently, and the figure stepped into view. It wasn't the man from earlier. Not exactly. This thing wore his face, but it was distorted, wrong. Its mouth stretched too wide, its eyes hollow and black. leaking trails of inky liquid that dripped onto the floor. Emily stumbled backward, knocking over a shelf. The creature lunged, its movements jerky, like a puppet on strings. Emily turned and ran, her screams echoing through the empty aisles. She darted into the stockroom, slamming the heavy door behind her. She pressed her back against it, gasping for air. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the building's generators. A noise behind her made her whip around. It was faint at first, a scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. And then the lights went out. Emily fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the pitch-black room. The beam of light revealed rows of shelves, crates stacked high, and nothing else. She exhaled shakily. "Get it together," she whispered to herself. But as she turned to the door, the scraping grew louder, closer. The sound wasn't coming from the stockroom. It was coming from inside the walls. Emily's flashlight flickered, and she smacked the phone in frustration. The light steadied just as a face emerged from the darkness, inches from hers. It was the man, or whatever he had become, his features twisted into a monstrous grin. Before she could scream, his hand shot out, dragging her into the shadows. The next morning, when the day shift employees arrived, the store was in disarray. The shelves were ransacked, merchandise strewn across the floor. Carl searched for Emily but found no trace of her, just her phone lying abandoned in the stockroom, its screen smeared with black, inky fingerprints. The security footage was later reviewed, but it only raised more questions. The cameras showed Emily talking to no one at the registers, running from empty aisles, and disappearing into the stockroom alone. Of the man she described, there was no sign. The frigid wind whipped through the dark parking lot as the Black Friday mob pressed against the glass doors of Parkdale Electronics. Inside, Lisa, a weary floor associate, adjusted the last display of discounted laptops. The store was eerily quiet compared to the roar of impatient customers outside. The countdown to midnight was almost over. "Ready for battle?" Mark, the security guard, asked with a wry smile. Lisa chuckled nervously. "Barely. I'm just hoping nobody gets hurt this year." Mark's smile faded. "Yeah, let's hope." The manager's voice crackled over the PA system. Doors opening in 5, 4, 3. The mob erupted into cheers. 2, 1. The doors slid open, and chaos flooded the store. People screamed, shoved, and darted toward shelves like starving animals. Lisa braced herself at her station, clutching her handheld scanner. As the stampede barreled through, a woman screeched as someone yanked a vacuum cleaner from her cart. Two men wrestled over a flat-screen TV, their voices rising to angry shouts. Lisa kept her head down, scanning items for the growing line at her register. But amid the chaos, a strange stillness caught her attention. At the edge of the gaming aisle stood a man in a black coat, motionless. His face was obscured by the hood, but something about his presence felt wrong. He wasn't shopping. He was just standing there, watching. Lisa tried to shake off the unease. She turned back to her work, scanning item after item until the line finally dwindled. By 2 a.m., the initial rush had subsided, leaving the store in relative calm. Employees wandered the aisles, picking up discarded boxes and abandoned carts. Lisa's break couldn't come soon enough. She retreated to the staff room, grabbing a stale sandwich from her bag. As she sat down, the door creaked open, and Mark peeked in. "You good?" he asked. "Yeah, just tired," Lisa replied. "It's been a madhouse." Mark nodded but hesitated. "Have you seen that guy in the black coat? He's been hanging around the gaming section for hours. Doesn't seem like he's shopping." Lisa frowned. "I noticed him earlier. Did anyone talk to him?" "Not yet," Mark said. "I'll check it out." Lisa watched him leave, a knot tightening in her stomach. Something about this night felt different, darker. Back on the floor, Lisa resumed organizing shelves. The store was quieter now, with only a few stragglers wandering the aisles. She glanced toward the gaming section and froze. The man in the black coat was gone. A sudden crash echoed from the appliance section. Lisa hurried over, finding a toppled display of blenders. The aisle was empty. As she bent down to pick up the boxes, she heard faint whispers. She stood still, straining to listen. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Goosebumps prickled her skin. "Hello?" she called out. No answer. The whispers stopped. Lisa's heart raced as she backed out of the aisle. She spotted Mark near the store's entrance and waved him over. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Mark looked confused. "Whispers, like Someone was talking, but no one was there. Mark frowned. This place is big. Sound carries weird sometimes. Lisa wasn't convinced, but she nodded. Okay, just keep an eye out, all right? Mark nodded and walked off. Lisa tried to focus on her tasks, but the sense of unease only grew. At 3:15 a.m., the lights flickered. A collective groan rose from the remaining customers. Then, without warning, the store plunged into darkness. Power outage? Someone muttered. The emergency lights buzzed to life, casting the aisles in dim, sickly yellow. Lisa grabbed her flashlight from under the register and clicked it on. The beam cut through the shadows, revealing overturned shelves and half-empty displays. Attention, everyone. The manager's voice came over the PA, shaky but calm. Please remain where you are. We're experiencing a temporary power outage. Lisa's flashlight swept across the aisles. That's when she saw him again, the man in the black coat. He stood at the far end of the store, completely still. Mark? She whispered into her radio. The guy's back, near the hardware aisle. I'm on it, Mark replied. Lisa kept her distance, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She watched as Mark approached the figure. Sir? Mark said. The store is closing soon. Can I help you find something? The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, the motion unnervingly slow. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, Mark said, his voice firmer now. The man finally moved. He reached up and pulled back his hood, revealing a face Lisa would never forget. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his skull, his eyes hollow, pits of darkness. A wide, unnatural grin split his face, teeth sharp and glistening. Mark stepped back. What the? The man lunged, faster than any human should move. He grabbed Mark and dragged him into the shadows. Mark's screams echoed through the store, then abruptly stopped. Lisa stumbled backward, her breath hitching. The other customers screamed, scattering in all directions. The store erupted into chaos once more, but this time it wasn't about deals. It was survival. The man reappeared, his movements jerky, almost mechanical. But now he wasn't alone. Shapes emerged from the shadows, figures with glowing eyes and twisted faces, crawling along the walls and ceiling like insects. Lisa ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she weaved through the aisles. She could hear the creatures behind her, their guttural growls growing louder. She reached the stockroom and slammed the door shut, locking it. Her hands shook as she dialed 911 on her phone. The operator answered, but before Lisa could speak, the whispers returned. They hissed through the phone, growing louder until they drowned out everything else. Then the line went dead. Lisa backed into a corner, clutching her flashlight like a weapon. The stockroom door rattled violently, the sound of claws scratching against metal. The lights flickered one last time and went out. In the suffocating darkness, Lisa heard a voice, low, guttural, and impossibly close. You can't hide. And then silence. The mall parking lot was packed beyond capacity, every car a silent sentinel in the cold November night. Inside Wilkins' department store, the air buzzed with tension. Employees darted around, restocking shelves, adjusting displays, and bracing for the impending Black Friday crowd. Claire, a seasonal hire, manned the toy section, dreading the midnight rush. She had heard horror stories from veteran employees, stampedes, fights, even a broken arm over a discounted TV. But it was just one shift, she told herself. One shift, and she'd be out of there with a paycheck. At 11:59 p.m., the store manager stood by the glass doors, his whistle in hand. A mob pressed against the glass, their faces distorted by condensation. Claire watched from her aisle, clutching her pricing gun like a lifeline. The whistle blew, and chaos erupted. The doors swung open, and the crowd surged inside, a tidal wave of frenzied shoppers. Shouts echoed through the store as people sprinted toward their desired deals. The toy section was no exception. Claire barely had time to step back before a woman yanked a doll from the shelf she was restocking. A man grabbed a box of toy cars, only to have it ripped from his hands by another shopper. The aisle turned into a battlefield, but Claire stayed rooted, trying not to get caught in the crossfire. Amid the chaos, Claire noticed a boy standing near the aisle's end. He couldn't have been older than 8, with wide, unblinking eyes and a stuffed rabbit clutched to his chest. His clothes were outdated, a gray sweater and corduroy pants, but what struck Claire was his stillness. "Hey, kid," she called out, raising her voice over the din. "Are you lost?" The boy didn't respond. He just stared at her, his expression blank. Claire glanced around, expecting a frantic parent to appear, but no one seemed to claim the boy. She stepped closer, weaving through the shoppers. "Where are your parents?" she asked, kneeling to his level. The boy tilted his head slightly as if confused by the question. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner. "Wait!" Claire called, standing up and following him. The crowd thinned as she moved further into the store's quieter sections. She caught a glimpse of the boy's rabbit disappearing into the bedding aisle. "Kid, it's not safe to wander around," she said, quickening her pace. She turned into the aisle and stopped cold. The boy was gone. The aisle was empty, the shelves lined with neatly folded blankets and pillows. A faint chill prickled her skin, though she didn't know why. Claire turned to head back to her section when she heard it. A faint giggle. It wasn't the cheerful sound of a child playing. It was high-pitched, echoing, and wrong. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. The giggle turned into whispers. They came from everywhere at once, too low for her to make out words, but loud enough to make her heart race. Claire clutched her pricing gun, scanning the empty aisle. Then the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then plunged the store into darkness. The emergency lights buzzed on, casting the aisles in dim, shadowy illumination. The whispers stopped. For a moment, the store was eerily silent. Then came the screams. They echoed from the front of the store, sharp and panicked. Claire froze, every instinct screaming at her to stay put. But the cries grew louder, more desperate, until she couldn't ignore them. She ran toward the noise, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. The toy section was in disarray, shelves overturned and merchandise scattered. But what chilled Claire to the core were the shoppers. They stood motionless, their backs to her, heads tilted at unnatural angles. Each one faced a single direction, staring at something she couldn't see. "Hello," Claire whispered, stepping closer. As one, the shoppers turned to face her. Their eyes were blank, their expressions eerily calm. The boy stood among them, his stuffed rabbit dangling from one hand. "You shouldn't have followed me," he said, his voice hollow and echoing. Claire stumbled back as the lights flickered again. When they stabilized, the shoppers were gone. The boy was gone. The entire store was silent, as if the chaos from earlier had never happened. She sprinted toward the break room, her breath hitching with every step. She slammed the door shut and grabbed her phone to call 911. The line connected, but all she heard was static. Then the whispers returned. They grew louder, filling the room until she had to press her hands over her ears. The lights above her buzzed and flickered, casting shifting shadows across the walls. And in the corner of the room stood the boy. "You can't leave," he said, stepping closer. "They never do." The lights went out completely, plunging the room into pitch black. Claire's scream echoed once before the whispers swallowed it whole. The night was icy, the wind howling like a distant predator outside Harper's department store. Every year, employees dreaded Black Friday, but this year felt worse. Something in the air made Sarah's skin crawl as she organized the electronics aisle. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting stark shadows on the walls. It was 11:45 p.m., just 15 minutes until the floodgates opened. Sarah wiped her clammy hands on her apron and glanced at the main entrance. A throng of people pressed against the glass doors, their faces distorted by the frost-covered panes. They weren't just eager, they looked ravenous. "Ready for the madness?" grumbled Tom, the store's grizzled security guard, as he passed by. "As ready as I'll ever be," Sarah muttered. Tom gave her a weary nod and trudged off toward the front. She envied his ability to keep calm, but tonight she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The countdown to midnight began over the PA system, the manager's voice tense. Doors opening in 5, 4, 3. Sarah braced herself. 2, 1. The crowd surged through the entrance like a tidal wave, screaming and shoving. Displays toppled, merchandise scattered across the floor as people clawed at shelves. Sarah kept her head down, trying to stay out of the chaos, but she couldn't help but notice one peculiar figure among the frenzy. A man in a tattered gray coat stood perfectly still in the middle of the aisle. His face was gaunt, eyes sunken deep into hollow sockets. He didn't fight for deals or even seem to shop. He just stood there, staring at Sarah. "Can I help you?" she called out, her voice shaky. The man didn't respond. He simply turned and walked deeper into the store, vanishing into the crowd. Sarah shook her head, trying to focus. Probably just another weirdo. This place always brought out the crazies. As the hours dragged on, the initial chaos subsided, leaving behind a few stragglers. Sarah worked quickly to clean up her section, her nerves fraying with every passing minute. The store was eerily quiet now, save for the occasional rustle of a cart or the faint hum of the HVAC system. Then she heard it, a soft tapping sound. It came from the end of the aisle, rhythmic and deliberate. Tap, 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 tap. Hello? She called out, peering around the corner. No one was there. The aisle was empty, but the sound continued, now accompanied by a faint scraping. Sarah's pulse quickened as she followed the noise, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. The sound led her to the storage section, where rows of metal shelving units loomed like silent sentinels. The light overhead flickered as she stepped inside. "Is someone there?" she whispered. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision. She whipped around, but saw nothing. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural chuckle that sent a shiver down her spine. "Tom?" she called out, hoping the security guard was nearby. "This isn't funny." The laughter grew louder, echoing off the walls. Sarah backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. Her foot caught on something, and she stumbled, falling to the cold tile floor. As she scrambled to her feet, the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the room, broken only by the faint red glow of the emergency exit sign. Sarah fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows, landing on a figure standing at the far end of the aisle. It was the man in the gray coat. He wasn't standing anymore. He was crawling. His limbs moved unnaturally, joints bending in ways they shouldn't. His head lolled to the side, and his empty eyes locked onto hers. "Help me," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. Sarah screamed, turning to run, but the man's voice echoed around her. "You can't leave. None of us can." She bolted through the aisles, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Every corner she turned seemed to lead her back to the same place. The storage section, with the man now closer than before. Her radio crackled to life. "Sarah, what's going on? I'm hearing weird noises," Tom's voice came through. "Tom, I'm in the storage section. Something's wrong." Her words were cut off by a piercing screech that made her drop the radio. The lights flickered back on, revealing the aisle now empty. The man was gone. Sarah grabbed the radio and ran toward the front of the store, her heart pounding. She reached the entrance where Tom stood wide-eyed. "Did you see him?" she gasped. "See who?" Tom asked, his face pale. Before she could answer, the store's speakers crackled, emitting a static-filled voice. "Help us," it whispered. The front doors slammed shut on their own, the locks clicking loudly. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered erratically. Tom grabbed Sarah's arm. "We're getting out of here." They ran to the back exit, but when they reached it, they found the door welded shut, the metal warped as if melted. "That wasn't like that earlier," Tom said, his voice shaking. A low rumble vibrated through the floor, and the air grew thick, heavy with the stench of decay. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping into a deafening cacophony. Sarah turned to Tom, her eyes wide with terror. "What's happening?" Before he could answer, the shadows around them began to move, coalescing into shapes, figures with glowing eyes and twisted, grinning faces. They surrounded the pair, blocking every escape. The man in the gray coat emerged from the darkness, his gaunt face now split by an unnatural smile. "Black Friday never ends," he said, his voice echoing with malevolent glee. The lights flickered one last time before plunging the store into the darkness. The air inside Fairview Plaza was thick with anticipation. Outside, the temperature had dropped below freezing, but that didn't stop the massive crowd pressing against the glass doors of Grayson's Electronics. The biggest Black Friday deal of the year, a 70-inch smart TV for $199 had drawn people like moths to a flame. Among them was Ellie, a part-time cashier trying to calm her nerves before the midnight opening. Ellie hated working Black Friday. She hated the chaos, the aggression, and the way people transformed into rabid animals over cheap gadgets. But tonight felt different. The air seemed heavier, charged with something she couldn't quite name. 5 minutes until we open, the store manager barked over the headset. Everyone in position. Ellie slid behind her register, eyeing the sea of faces through the glass. One stood out, a man in a black hoodie standing perfectly still in the center of the crowd. His head was tilted slightly, and though Ellie couldn't see his eyes beneath the hood, she felt his gaze lock onto her. A chill crept up her spine. "Ellie, you good?" asked Josh, one of the stock clerks. "Yeah," she lied. forcing a tight smile. The countdown began over the loudspeaker. At the stroke of midnight, the doors were unlocked and the crowd surged inside. Ellie gripped the counter as the sound of shouting and stampeding feet filled the air. Within seconds, the store descended into chaos. Shelves toppled, boxes flew, and the shrill cries of customers echoed everywhere. As Ellie rang up purchase after purchase, she kept glancing toward the entrance. The man in the hoodie was gone. She tried to shake off her unease, focusing on the endless stream of customers. "Cash or card?" she asked a woman clutching a discounted laptop. The woman didn't respond. She simply handed over her credit card, her hands trembling. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, as if she were in a trance. "You okay, ma'am?" Ellie asked. The woman didn't answer. She just stared at Ellie, her lips parting slightly as if to speak. Then, without warning, she turned and walked away, leaving the laptop behind. Ellie called after her, but the woman disappeared into the crowd. "Ellie, we need you in electronics," her manager's voice crackled over the headset. She hurried toward the back of the store, weaving through the frenzied shoppers. When she reached the electronics section, her stomach dropped. The shelves were in complete disarray, and a strange silence hung in the air. A few customers stood motionless, their backs to her. "Hello?" Ellie called out. The customers didn't move. They stood perfectly still, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Ellie hesitated, a knot forming in her stomach. Then she noticed it. Every TV on the wall displayed the same image, static, broken by flashes of a shadowy figure. The longer she stared, the clearer the figure became. It was the man in the hoodie. His head snapped toward the camera, and his face filled the screen. His eyes were hollow, black voids, and his mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. "You shouldn't be here," a voice whispered behind her. Ellie spun around, but no one was there. The TVs buzzed loudly, the static growing more intense. The screens began to flicker, each one now showing something different, grainy footage of the store itself. She saw herself standing in the electronics section, looking frightened and alone. Then she saw the hooded man. He was standing right behind her. Ellie screamed and whirled around, but the aisle was empty. The TVs went dark, leaving her in deafening silence. She stumbled back, her breath ragged. A loud crash echoed from the next aisle, followed by a guttural growl. Ellie froze, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to move. Slowly, she peered around the corner. The shoppers who had been standing motionless were now on all fours, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they clawed at the floor. Their eyes were black, their mouths stretched into horrific, silent screams. The hooded man stood among them, his figure tall and imposing. "They're here for you," he said, his voice reverberating like a low hum. Ellie bolted, her heart pounding as she raced toward the front of the store. The aisles seemed to stretch endlessly, warping and shifting like a twisted labyrinth. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows. She finally reached the checkout area, but it was deserted. Registers were abandoned, and the once packed store was eerily quiet. The glass doors were still wide open, but beyond them was nothing but darkness. No parking lot, no cars, just an infinite void. "Help!" she screamed, her voice echoing into the emptiness. A hand clamped down on her shoulder, and she spun around to see Josh. Relief flooded her chest, but it was short-lived. His eyes were pitch black, his face twisted into a grotesque grin. "You can't leave," he said, his voice overlapping with a dozen others. Ellie backed away, but her retreat was cut short as the hooded man emerged from the shadows. He raised a hand, and the darkness outside began to seep into the store, swallowing the lights and aisles. Ellie's screams were the last sound to echo through the void before the store was consumed entirely. By morning, Grayson's electronics would stand empty, its shelves undisturbed, its doors locked. The store would never open again, and neither Ellie nor the other employees would ever be found. But every Black Friday, the lights would flicker on at midnight, and faint whispers would drift from the static-filled TV's sleigh, calling for anyone foolish enough to enter. The line outside Greystone Mall began forming before sundown, an endless wave of bargain hunters ready to storm the stores the moment the clock struck midnight. Inside the mall, Mallory, a night shift custodian, watched the crowd through the tinted glass doors. She hated Black Friday. The chaos, the noise, the sheer madness, it all felt wrong. But tonight, there was something else in the air, something heavier, colder. Mallory adjusted her gloves and pushed her cleaning cart down the dimly lit corridor. The mall was eerily quiet now, a stark contrast to the muffled roar of the crowd outside. She glanced at her watch. 11:30. Only 30 more minutes of peace before the frenzy began. The intercom crackled, and Mr. Hargrove, the mall manager, spoke in his usual monotone. All staff to their positions. Opening in 25 minutes. Let's make this smooth. Mallory rolled her eyes. Smooth? Black Friday? She continued mopping near the food court, the rhythmic swish of water against tiles the only sound. But then a soft thud echoed from somewhere behind her. She stopped, gripping the mop handle tightly. Hello? She called, her voice barely louder than a whisper. Silence. She scanned the empty food court, the tables and chairs casting long, distorted shadows in the dim light. It was probably just something falling off a cart, she told herself. But when she turned back to her cart, she froze. One of the chairs had moved. It was now several feet from the table where it had been moments before. Her heart raced as she stared at it, the chair's metal legs glinting faintly under the flickering overhead lights. Stop freaking out, she muttered to herself. She pushed the chair back and resumed mopping, but her ears were on high alert now, straining for any sound. Another thud, this time louder. Mallory spun around, her breath catching in her throat. All the chairs in the food court were now scattered, tipped over or pushed into bizarre configurations. She hadn't heard anyone come in, and there was no way someone could move them so quickly. Who's there? She demanded, her voice trembling. A shadow flitted at the edge of her vision, darting between the tables. Mallory's chest tightened as she fumbled for the flashlight on her cart. She clicked it on and swept the beam across the room. Tom, Brenda, if this is a joke, it's not funny. No reply. The flashlight's beam caught something, a figure standing perfectly still at the far end of the food court. It was tall and humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, its head slightly too large. Its face, if it even had one, was hidden in the darkness. Mallory took a shaky step back. You're not supposed to be in here, she stammered. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion. Then it stepped forward, its feet making no sound against the tiles. Mallory stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking in her hands. Stay back, she shouted, but the figure didn't stop. It moved closer, each step impossibly fluid, as though its body were made of liquid shadows. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered and died, plunging the food court into darkness. Mallory's flashlight was the only source of light, and its weak beam barely illuminated the space around her. She spun in a circle, trying to find the figure, but it was gone. Her radio crackled. Mallory, where are you? The doors are opening soon, came Hargrove's annoyed voice. She grabbed the radio, her voice shaking. There's something in here. I saw. The radio cut to static, and a distorted voice whispered through the crackling noise. You shouldn't have stayed. Mallory dropped the radio, her blood turning to ice. The voice didn't sound human. It was layered, like multiple voices speaking in unison. A scraping noise came from behind her. She whipped around, the flashlight beam landing on a trail of smeared footprints on the tile. They weren't normal footprints. They were elongated, with claw-like impressions at the tips. The trail led deeper into the mall. Mallory wanted to run, to scream, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. The air around her grew colder, and a faint, otherworldly hum filled her ears. The scraping sound grew louder, closer. She turned the flashlight toward the noise, and there it was, the figure now inches away from her. Its face was a void, a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to pull at her very soul. It reached out with an impossibly long arm, its fingers stretching toward her. Mallory dropped the flashlight and bolted, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the floor. She ran blindly through the mall, her breath ragged and tears streaming down her face. She reached the main entrance where Hargrove and a few other staff members were unlocking the doors. Help me, she screamed, her voice cracking. They turned to her, confusion and annoyance on their faces. What the hell's wrong with you? Hargrove snapped. Before Mallory could respond, the glass doors exploded inward, shards flying like deadly missiles. The crowd outside surged forward, but they weren't normal shoppers anymore. Their faces were twisted, eyes glowing an unnatural red. They moved like puppets, jerking and twitching as they flooded into the mall. Mallory screamed as the wave of distorted figures engulfed her, their clawed hands grabbing and pulling her into the darkness. The last thing she saw was Hargrove's horrified face as the lights flickered one final time, and then the mall went silent. When authorities arrived the next morning, the mall was eerily pristine. The shelves were untouched, the floors immaculate, and the entrance sealed tight. Of the employees and shoppers, there was no sign, just the faint hum of static playing over the PA system. And every year on Black Friday, the mall lights flicker to life, and faint screams echo through the halls, begging to be heard. The town of Hollow Creek had only one department store, an old brick building that served as the center of life for miles around. Every Black Friday, people from neighboring towns would flood in, desperate for the deals. But locals whispered about strange things that happened every year. Missing shoppers, employees who quit without explanation, and, most chillingly, the shadow in the stockroom. Taylor, a high school senior, had just started her first job at the store. She needed extra money for college applications. So when her manager, Mrs. Dane, asked her to work the Black Friday shift, she couldn't say no. The older employees had exchanged glances when Taylor agreed, but no one said anything. The shift started at midnight, and Taylor arrived at 11:30 p.m. The store was already buzzing with activity as the staff prepared for the onslaught of customers. Taylor was assigned to the toy section, where the hottest item, a dancing robot named Gigglebot, was expected to sell out in minutes. "Stay out of the stockroom," Mrs. Dane said as she handed Taylor a pricing gun. Her tone was casual, but her eyes were serious. "Why?" Taylor asked, laughing nervously. "Just don't," Mrs. Dane replied, and walked away. Taylor shrugged it off, thinking it was just some kind of workplace hazing. As the doors opened at midnight, the crowd poured in like a tidal wave, screaming and shoving as they raced to grab whatever they could. Within minutes, the store was pure chaos. Taylor was overwhelmed, scanning items and dodging frantic shoppers who tore through the shelves like wild animals. "Excuse me," a woman shrieked, clutching a box of Gigglebots. "There's none left? Do you have more in the back?" Taylor hesitated, remembering Mrs. Dane's warning. I'm not sure. Let me check with someone." But the woman wasn't having it. "Just look. It'll only take a second." Feeling pressured, Taylor nodded. She pushed her way through the crowd and headed toward the stockroom. The fluorescent lights flickered as she approached the heavy metal door. It stood slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeped out. "Hello?" Taylor called, stepping inside. The room was vast and dimly lit, with rows of towering shelves packed with merchandise. The air felt wrong, stale and heavy, like it hadn't been touched in years. She quickly scanned the shelves for the toy and spotted a box labeled Gigglebots on the top shelf. Dragging over a rolling ladder, she climbed up and grabbed the box. As she descended, she heard it, a low, guttural sound like a growl echoing through the stockroom. "Is someone there?" she asked, her voice trembling. Silence. Taylor clutched the box tightly and hurried toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, it slammed shut on its own. She yelped and dropped the box, the contents spilling across the floor. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Taylor's breath hitched as she backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room. Something moved in the shadows between the shelves, something large and humanoid, but distorted. Its limbs were too long, its movements too jerky. "Who's there?" Taylor whispered, tears streaming down her face. The figure stepped into the dim light, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all, just a black void, as though its head was covered in a writhing mass of shadows. Its mouth opened, impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed to shimmer like glass. Taylor screamed and ran deeper into the stockroom, weaving between shelves. She could hear it behind her, its footsteps growing faster, the sound of its breathing like a furnace. She rounded a corner and spotted an old service elevator. Slamming the button, she prayed it still worked. The doors creaked open, and she threw herself inside, jamming the close button repeatedly. The creature rounded the corner just as the doors shut. Its hollow eyes met hers, and it grinned, a horrific, knowing grin. The elevator lurched downward, but instead of stopping at the ground floor, it kept descending. The temperature dropped, and the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. The light in the elevator flickered, and Taylor noticed something carved into the walls, symbols and words in a language she didn't recognize, all etched deep into the metal. When the elevator finally stopped, the doors opened to darkness. A faint, rhythmic sound echoed from the void beyond, like chanting, low and guttural. Taylor hesitated, but before she could decide whether to step out, a hand, cold and skeletal, grabbed her ankle from below. She screamed and kicked, freeing herself just as the hand disappeared into the shadows beneath the elevator. Scrambling to her feet, she slammed the up button, but the elevator didn't move. The chanting grew louder, closer. A figure emerged from the darkness, a robed, hooded being that seemed to float rather than walk. Its head tilted unnaturally as it raised an arm, pointing directly at Taylor. The shadows around it writhed, forming clawed hands that reached for her. The elevator jolted and began ascending rapidly, the doors slamming shut just before the shadows could reach her. Taylor collapsed against the wall, sobbing. When the doors reopened, she was back in the stockroom. The lights were on and everything was silent, as if nothing had happened. She stumbled out, clutching her chest, only to find the store in disarray. Shoppers were gone, the shelves were bare, and the few employees left stood frozen, their faces pale and eyes wide. "Taylor!" Mrs. Dane grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. "Where did you go?" "The stockroom," Taylor stammered. There was something down there." Mrs. Dane's face darkened. "You shouldn't have gone in there," she whispered. "No one ever comes back the same." Taylor quit that night. She never returned to the store, but every Black Friday she dreams of the stockroom, of the chanting, and of the creature's grin. And every year, Hollow Creek's department store hires new employees, fresh faces unaware of what lurks behind the metal door.